Hello everyone, today we talk about the Merovingians and the rise of the Pippinids-Arnulfings, also known as the Carolingians. I think we actually made already a video that covered the same topic, but if I'm not wrong, it's going to be different anyway, but also I think it was based on different points that we're going to make today. Trying to look a bit more, very superficially actually, into properly the Merovingian times, in what they were, what is that this big system transformed itself like throughout the 2 centuries more of its existence, and how obviously it triggered the rise of the Carolingians, but more specifically what was its legacy and how much can we know in part about it, in aside from most of the Merovingian history is very often known as this very intricate plot of extremely violent dynastic struggles, which is absolutely true in many ways, but there is also naturally from the historiography that we know of it from the time, from also later times, also Carolingian times importantly speaking, as we will see probably a damnatio memoriae of the same Merovingians. That also, if you think about the work of Gregory of Tours, also during the earlier times, is a critique of the traditional, say, Germanic and pagan alike way of life of most of the Frankish counts for a very long time, even after the formal Christianization of the people, that, however, took 200 years and to be properly completed, and yet also not really working in the functionally Christian idea of the term, and that definitely, however, is at the base of this enormous change in European society that many have to which many have attributed the same birth. Maybe it's an excess in the sense of the idea of Europe in itself. It's usually attributed to Charlemagne. And it's a forced interpretation of the thing. Naturally, everything was way more contingential than any deterministic or teleological idea of the Merovingian policy and so on. But I stress this because I think that there is an enormous Merovingian legacy that has been overlooked, not just for what concerns properly the foundation of the Frankish kingdom by Clovis. It was something truly revolutionary from what the Germanic customs were concerned. It actually was a trauma. It was an extremely brutal and violent and even unthinkable thing from a traditional perspective. They must have seen the thing in very dark ways at some levels. We have talked about Clovis himself, and that easily during the migration year, if you pick him or Theodoric or Gaiseric or Alaric, you have there one of the single most important and influential figures of the time. But I speak also and specifically of the legacy of the Merovingian world in theory, let's say in the later phase, the 7th century, which is considered in fact a moment of decline of naturally not just of the dynasts, but of Frankish power altogether, because as you know, the thing simply fell apart by itself, given the basis on which it was founded, given the broader international context, also the environmental situation in some way, as in other areas of Europe, right? But nevertheless, this is the point, this kings fainéants, as they were called by French historiography in a mocking sense, and on the base for different political reasons of the time, the concept was expressed in this form, but probably also looking at the Carolingian historiography, what they believed the Merovingian world had been. Merovingian world is dramatically documented, considering the later, even previous, say not previous, but from the moment of foundation of Clovis, we know fairly a lot. By the the end of the 6th, the most of the 7th century, we start knowing less, I guess, most areas of Europe. But probably there was the Frankish kingdom fell apart in a way, practically speaking, in terms of practice, unity of government. But it remained as an institution, not just of royal character, and together with it properly in a dynastic and private sense that we have explained many times, but also in an imperial and mystical sense, in a religious sense, the mystics of the monarchy, in a properly imperial and therefore, Roman derived also view of what that had to be. That's we can't today. We will not talk about Clovis because we did it on other occasions, but essentially what the thing was there, right? If you just look at Merovingian coins throughout all the 6th, even great part of the 7th century, those represented are Roman emperors, right? Roman monarchs. The enormous impact of the Roman legacy in the construction of the Frankish monarchy is the key to understand the whole system in itself. As we were saying, that's where also the trauma, together with the Christianization within the properly Frankish Germanic world, actually was about. Today we will briefly see also how there was properly a struggle within the same Frankish people even after the foundation of the kingdom and the settlement of the Franks across this broad area of fundamentally Central Europe, and therefore the capacity of the Merovingians to properly institutionalize this system over time. Right, other systems developed in different ways. Others were wiped out. The Frankish world is at this point something I believe deeply overlooked, generally speaking, even in not just in popular culture, of course, but historiographically speaking. I think that we rarely look at it in the universalistic sense that I presume Clovis had tried to give it, right? Not perhaps completely rationalizing the idea of an imperial reality that naturally comes just with Charlemagne, and that takes, in fact, a fully institutionalized form. It was also quite ambiguous, as you know, for what also the Byzantine Empire at that point was concerned. The papacy, this medium. That's all another part of history, but properly the idea that fundamentally the Frankish, or better properly the Merovingians, because that's the passage from the people to the dynasty that no other Romano-Germanic country had and would ever see, right, in the same fashion, really was concerned. I mean, essentially taking every single possible instrument of self-legitimization, Germanic, Roman, and properly imperial, right, as shares like Clovis had received from Constantinople, the vicary of the Gauls, of course. There was this obvious realization that the Roman Empire was still there, that, of course, in 476, absolutely nothing happened. Right, there was no change whatsoever. The empire would never die. Nobody thought, even remotely, that in the West the empire had died. Nobody, simply because everybody had an interest to make it function still, on assuming essentially the legacy of it, right, the heritage of it at many levels. And this is quite clear, especially in the Merovingian, in the case of the Merovingians. And pretty much almost any other Romano-Germanic entity. But that, in the case of the Franks, is, I think, more fascinating, because objectively the Franks were way less Romanized also than and Christianized for that matter, than other areas of Europe, of course, right? Even in Gaul, of course, Burgundy or Aquitaine were more Christian than the north actually was. We know from papal letters that still by the beginning of the 7th century, the Christianization allegedly came at the end of the 5th, so made human sacrifices. We know that they didn't understand Latin. The clergy didn't understand it. In places like Bavaria, here the thing gets complicated because there are also all the other peoples that technically were under this big empire. That's why the Merovingians created an empire proper, because they had their own Francia or Francia in the north, Neustria, Austrasia. Then they had all these Teilreichen, as they're called in German historiography, that were all these various chunks of other peoples that fundamentally had been, had made it to create something, institutionalized, formally institutionalized, like the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, and so on, but they had ended up absorbed by Frankish power. So that's all another story, how the thing was formed. We made several videos about that. There is probably a Frankish history playlist, so if you want to look at it, do it. But naturally what is fascinating in here is mostly the synthesis of the Gallo-Roman Germanic cultures in all this process, and how the dynasty, the monarchy, played always on this double level that was similarly done actually also in the other countries, but I think in the Merovingian case was more evident because the institutional architecture was way more structured and complex and took really every possible mean to reinforce itself of a properly Christian kingdom, and the reality of these communities that was very far, to say the least, from that in most cases, and naturally also the differences that existed in all these various chunks of the I always undecided to say whether kingdom or empire, but I explained what's the point in there. Obviously and predictably, maybe, and this is maybe too deterministic, but of course the Romance part, not the Germanic part, of the side, won. I say unavoidably in many ways because, of course, Gaul was dramatically more advanced than, Austrasia. The center of power, even, the same Austrasia arrived up to Reims, there was all these various, well, essentially 4 kingdoms, right, at some point of they all had their capitals shifted mostly. I mean, capital is a big word for Merovingian times, but the centers of power, say, but were all shifted towards this. The central corners where these 4 chunks met, that is close to the Ile-de-France, and more in general were also, in fact, the cradle of eventually the French, the Western Frankish, the French monarchy eventually was formed in this continuous competition between these various chunks. Right, as we have seen also, the main problem was that the Franks never learned how public authority worked. They just ruled with the force of arms, and this right that was held by every of the noble, let's say, properly of the Merovingian family, the sons, the king's sons, to get their equal chunk of the kingdom for themselves, right? And this was naturally imitated at the lower echelons by all the other components of society, mostly the nobility, that rose dramatically in Merovingian times. In fact, among the Carolingian legacies, let's say the Merovingian legacies in the Carolingian era, there is in fact the realization that far before Charles Martell, the process of aristocratization of the Frankish world had already essentially been born by itself. It was not even just a proper Merovingian construction, right? It was mostly a practice of government, and naturally when the Frankish kingdom as a unity fell apart by the end of the 7th century, all the surroundings, all the periphery began to privatize ever more dramatically, even if it was namely on behalf of the same king, but de facto actually being just the consequence of the lack of central power, the very large availability of resources already concentrated in the hands of very few people since a very early time in Gaul, thanks chiefly to the fact that Gaul, after all, had not gone so much devastated during the migration era, unlike other areas of Europe. So these enormous estates that had remained in part since late Roman times simply passed into the hands of the new hybrid elite of Gallo-Romans and Germans that created eventually even just the Carolingian world broadly meant, when especially it acquired this universal character as we know it, and eventually the development of of feudalism on the long run, this Vassalatic-Beneficiary system that already existed since late Roman times in some ways. We made videos about this, actually, about the commendatio, about all these idea of the dominus of the vastus, of these terms that even quite, just etymologically speaking, show quite clearly the meeting ground between the Celtic, the Roman, and the German world in what Gaul, and especially northern Gaul, actually was. So there would be too much to say in as an introduction. We will probably digress at some point during the video, as usual, but I'll try to make it compact, because also at the end I want to arrive to at least to highlight the dynamics of the rise of the Carolingians in this context and what we can learn from it, just in perspective, considering the legacy of the Merovingian world. Believe me that there is a lot to tell, which we will have to do in many other videos specifically dedicated, especially to the construction of the monarchic mystics, let's say, of the Merovingian world, and also its military and hematophiliac character. The Franks were obsessed with blood. At every level of their world, their society, well, all they knew was how to use the sword, to go on horseback, and owning the land, and managing this enormous, amounts of territories and communities that, altogether were without a true center, and this naturally triggered this intrinsic conflictuality. There are some that, however, did give rise to something more functional, and that's why I think we should credit the Merovingian legacy. Also, there are lots of other anthropological aspects. We will have to look at them chiefly in the series about the history of chivalry. We will look at that in detail. Today, unfortunately, we can't. It's more like a political, institutional history. So we can immediately see that since the first decades of the 6th century, the Frankish kingdom was crossed by a strong internal conflict, right? This process started immediately after Clovis' death in 511. As we were saying, the king split his domain, his kingdom, to his own 4 sons, following this traditional custom among the Germans that didn't admit any firstborn right, primacy, predilection, let's say, in during the inheritance, but also and especially and altogether with it, of course, the principles of a patrimonial conception of power, according to which the kingdom was equated to a private asset, right, and therefore had to be split among the heirs of the sovereign. This concept is, in a way, at the base of, this thing stopped literally in 1789, up to 1918, depending on the eras, right? But in the introduction, we naturally forgot to tell that the Merovingian legacy is dramatically important as far as we're concerned, just banally because these areas were the ones from which eventually some of the major European countries and also if you take especially the French monarchy, would maintain this very advanced over time naturally, and not so in connection with the Merovingian world in this sense. But the first creation of monarchic power was statual capabilities, right? But conceived still as a large signory, and this is properly what begins in many ways in French culture. The Holy Roman Empire as essentially the same Frankish Empire, right? Because the Holy Roman Empire was not refounded by the Ottonians, it was just the same that existed before. Nobody at the time even remotely imagined that that was another empire, as many people, I don't know exactly for which reason, like to believe. If it's a nationalistic thing, it's idiotic by definition, but especially it's an insult to the historical understanding and beliefs and values of these very people we're discussing here. So there is no way out of that. This is the same concept of imperium that the Germans were inheriting from Rome, as also part of their tribal culture, in this broader universal mindset that was at the base of any people at the time. They shared the concept of power as divine legitimization by virtue, which is exactly what Clovis was thinking, right? Even in here, every concept of Christianization is merely functional, right? These people remain obviously pagan, as much as they were Christians, right? Because as we've explained countless times, it's completely normal. It's what properly defines a pagan to accept every single religion at every single time, according to its contractualistic usage, in extremely, in fact, pragmatic terms. So it was way more difficult for a Christian, at least those who were fully Christianized, to accept paganism than it was paganism to actually go together with Christianism. And there is an overwhelming amount of documentation about the Frankish world, in the sense of the elites were namely Christians, of course, but first of all, they weren't truly understanding much of what the business really was. They went on with their lifestyles at every level, had multiple concubines. They really didn't have much of a peaceful mindset in much understanding or respect for Christian principles, if not for what matched with their cultures. They were mostly about war, fundamentally, right? And this is why also the Franks actually would be, and especially the Carolingians at some point, obsessed with the Old Testament, because they read in the Old Testament everything they truly loved. Every possible bloodshed you can imagine. God as Lord of Battles, that a God that literally descends on earth to fight alongside the chosen people that the Franks thought they were. Right? This is the point, and this is beyond pagan and Christian. Like every people at the time, remember that the chosen people in form of mindset in the world have been the Jews, the Romans, and the Franks. These people were truly convinced, without even discussing the concept, without even posing themselves the problem, that they were the chosen people, historically speaking. And this concept naturally was reinforced in the Roman Empire and in the Frankish world, as soon as, of course, they were Christianized, because the Bible provided overwhelming material for this. Charlemagne thought he was David, right? That was basically a Jewish mindset. We have to be extremely clear about this, because this is absolutely well documented, and it's perfectly matching with the Germanic way of thinking at a military level. That's what they were. These people were barely, not only Christianized, but barely literate, barely organized. They didn't know what a state was proper, right? Clovis, this enlightened, because even in here in perspective, Clovis was one of the greatest minds of the time, in my opinion, and he surely understood the benefits of a statual form. But aside from the fact that even in the Roman world it was coming apart, and that, of course, embracing the legacy of the Roman culture in Gaul as a necessary mean of government, because no Frank could govern in this area if it didn't have the support of the local, especially bishops, that were already the lords and the rulers of the land. And that's where the syncresis at an elite level that produced that mythology of the monarchy, while the rest of the Franks were lived in ways that were very different and changed. And of course, they were being absorbed also within the Gallic society. Important differences existed between Neustria and Austrasia, as we will see now. But he probably realized that in order to rule this enormous territory, right, they began to conquer basically every people they had around. They were the largest power ever built by a namely Germanic power. They had to organize, they had to centralize in a way. He settled this idea of the comites, were trying to settle his men of trust already in the various areas, these various chunks among the subjected peoples and so on. The thing failed over time, because over time the same power of the Merovingian monarchy shrank dramatically. So all of these elites understood, however, that they were part of this greater wall, right, of this great delegation of power, that they probably understood also in a religious sense. That is to say, if the Merovingians have conquered all this, world and have managed to maintain it under its control, right, the thing went on institutionally speaking. So of course at the beginning, the Merovingians were hated by the Franks. Clovis literally decapitated basically every single opponent that he found in front of him. Clovis was a man of incredible vision and lucidity and capacity. It's incredible what he done, and it was achieved almost exclusively by bloodshed. Right? They knew what they were doing. They pretty much knew what it was about, and they managed to impose this thing, so that when even the basically the statal fabric of what was left of the Roman administration, etc., can't say completely vanished, but at least simply mingled with the rest of fused itself with the rest of these communities. This world that began to be fairly homogeneous at some levels, especially in terms of the certification of society. That is, that there is just an elite and lots of other people now that doesn't matter whether they were former Romans or Germans, they are now becoming servants of this elite. And that's where also the chivalry comes from as a way of life, as a military way of life, extremely elitistic, with an idea, in fact, it was of blind religious faith in arms, and that's what the Bible and also the pagan background, these people exalted these elites and made it possible to accept this greater, in fact, grandeur proper that we find also in the imperial legacy of the Carolingians in the Frankish world. These Franks thought they were the chosen people that had made the thing, that had come to rule in the West, basically uncontrasted. Right, there is no comparison between the power of the Anglo-Saxons, of course, obviously, but even larger things like the Visigothic kingdom or the Lombard kingdom. They all had their own characteristics, but the Frankish kingdom was an enormous thing. Right, it had this emanatistic wave that was felt all around. By the way, all these Romano-Germanic kingdoms were in constant contact among each other. Right, they didn't live isolated one from one another. There is surely a lot of particularism in this world that is mostly highlighted by the eventual Carolingian reforms of the script, of culture, this homogenization of Western Europe as we know it in the lands of the Carolingian Empire at its peak. But properly, the Merovingians were able to play at this higher level, so to imbue, we can say, all society with this idea that, after all, the monarchy was a thing on its own, right? They had managed to make these peoples completely surpass the idea that they were all scattered clans, like the Franks were, right? The Franks were amongst some of the least stratified peoples at the beginning of, their settlement in Gaul. Naturally, the dialectic with the Gallo-Romans in this sense, and the hybrid, the osmosis began immediately, but it could have been like the Alemanni, just to make you an example. They were very similar, as a matter of fact, at different levels, but they managed to destroy this Germanic freeman middle class and to impose this elite mindset. It was much closer to the one of a Roman dominus, of a Roman lord, of a Gallo-Roman lord, than of a regular Germanic chieftain, and to elevate the same Frankish elite to that level, right? Obviously, in alliance, in name, in formal, undebated, I'd say, alliance with Christianity. It was the only way, because the Franks had no way to come. They were, by the way, the Franks, as you know, were told many times, they were the only Germanic people that basically didn't pass through Arianism in the process of, Catholicization. They went straight with Clovis from paganism. Of course, there was some Christian among the Franks already at the time, but they were basically pagan, to Catholicism, right, without passing through any ambiguity between this Arianism that at some point we will see now partially have some ideas, and even certain dynastic problems happen here, was conceived as an international shutout in an anti-Roman fashion, right? This was very important. The Germans had accepted to be Christianized as Arians, though, to say that, okay, we get, as Christians, we are recognized as interlocutors by the Roman Empire, but we're still kind of our own way of that. There was essentially a Germanism at some levels that probably was connected to the idea, should we become Roman and Christian, or should we remain German and pagan, right? And there was an enormous debate about this. The same Clovis was probably torn apart, considering his legacy. His mother was Thuringian, famously. So we're talking about the most hard stock of pagans out there, in an anti-Frankish and anti-Catholic, in this sense, properly an anti-Roman fashion. His father was basically a Roman general, right? Meaning a Frank under Roman, in the Roman arm, as a main leader of these Germanic chieftains that were now taking care of Gaul on behalf of Rome, what was left of it practically in the West. And we understand his greatness exactly because of the step he took in that regard, right? He decided, without no coming back, we become Roman and Catholic, right? And that's how possibly the single most, to me, what Constantine did and Clovis is equatable in terms of sheer legacy. Possibly in relative terms, what Clovis did even more, right? Given the consequences, given the how history went over the centuries proper. Because what did it change the history of the entire world forever? Starting from this properly Merovingian world. But the problem was exactly this, that in this there was just a recognition of this private clientele as the same Gallo-Roman one had become, de facto, as the same Germans reasoned like, because we sometimes think that the Germanic world has this sense of freedom that we tend to equate, first of all, wrongly to democracy, and also to a sort of public regulation. The Germanic world was completely not like that. What we see as in a democratic sense was just about the oligarchs that ruled over, especially at this time, at a very advanced stage of the migration era, over a freaking lot of freemen that were their clients, as a matter of fact. And secondly, their idea of public was just, not to make, it was just a preemptive mean to not to make rise the king over the others. But the practice meant, crudely, that these oligarchs behaved like kings within their own boundaries, right? And that's always, and there was no trace of public, function in that sense by the slightest. It was exclusively a private mindset. And the Merovingians brought it with themselves, right? Independently from what Clovis thought this could eventually transform like, and the tendency was definitely to privatization in Europe because of the collapse of the state, of the Roman state, and whoever wanted to imitate it. The people couldn't, there wasn't a factor that could change this mechanism. These are things that took really centuries and centuries, and you find them still in, I don't know, in the French nobility as the same principle of the Ancien Régime, right? Before the state, as we know, properly the absolute state, we could call it with Code Napoleon, becomes the only source of law, right? So this whole dominion that Clovis had built with iron and blood, except against the Gallo-Roman elites that were the ones that properly allowed him to do all this in this still, more civilly constructive context, believed, and here the German arrives, that of course, because of that, of the same fact he was enabled to do it by God, whichever it was, and definitely the Gallo-Roman bishops made him more than believe him that it was more than the case to be so, he considered all what he had conquered not, a domain of the Franks, but his own domain. This is typical. You find it even with William the Conqueror. I mean, it's properly within this lack of public horizons in most of our early medieval times. It's the idea that if I conquered something subordinate, risking my life and the one of my family and my work and my clients, all what I have, right, it was constantly at stake. This thing now belongs exclusively to me, and nobody can touch it. Right? This is something that entails, in reality, a strong step of civilization, because it's not that the world Clovis was coming from, as we have seen, was anything better. We told too many times the history of the vase of Soissons. That is one of the most beautiful, and it tells Clovis in a nutshell. But if you remember that's exactly the point. It's not that the guy that Clovis split the head of whom like a cucumber in half with his axe was a poor, proud German that just cared about his freedom. That was the next guy who would have done the same exact thing Clovis did if he had had the opportunity. And the idea there is that already the king had become what he was, in his view, by sheer military power, and did not accept it at the point of breaking that pact of sharing the loot with all the others, right? And punishing this objective crime that Frankish chieftain had done by breaking the vase of the Bishop of Soissons, that he, according to the legend, of course, this is Gregory of Tours, and Gregory of Tours naturally saw Clovis as the perfect Christian, in absolute terms, great guy, and his successor just a bunch of, evil thugs, as much as most of basically of the Frankish nobility, which they practically were. But there is also logic in what they were doing that is overshadowed by this more edifying historiography. And therefore he breaks properly the equilibrium. That's not a bunch of tribesmen anymore. That's properly a monarchy. And that's the concept of it all. It's a monarchy in the etymological sense. It comes from monos, from a single person. And his family, because of course the Germans had this idea of obsession, like the family, the bloodline of the clan, right, that couldn't be eliminated in this sense. So that this is not a Frankish kingdom. This is properly a Merovingian kingdom. It's their private business. And Voto touches this. By the way, that sounds, the whole lexicon sounds very much mob-like. And this is the mob. This is exactly the same way every single society has worked before the modern state. There is no other way to control the world, if not through this clientelist system. It's all a huge private clientele. It's all about favors and exchange. This is the thing. There's no difference between tribute and hush money. It's the same world. There's no other rule but yourself. And you understand where the idea of chivalry and feudalism, in this sense, this atrociously elitistic sense of oneself that the elite had, that had absolutely nothing. By the way, it's very fascinating because this has absolutely nothing to do with any national idea, right? The Franks believed, of course, they were the chosen people, but the only one that counted anything were these ones. So it was a way of saying, okay, yes, we belong to this, but it was very far from the idea that some nationalistic person would like to impose that these were caring about the people in a national sense. These people cared exclusively about themselves and how the people could help them in the process, or most of the times just, lessening them into obliged to transform them into servants to work for them. And this is exactly what they did. So reading history in nationalistic sense is an insult enough for the, non-existent intelligence of nationalistic people, because they don't even know that nationalism was born with the nation state, which is essentially the denial of anything that was believed before. So where these people would like to draw, confirmation and support for their ideas. If these people had seen what you were now, they would spit in your face, because objectively to their standards, you're just a disgusting subhuman. And that's exactly how they thought at the time you were. And this is something that existed up, in fact, to, very recent, for very few centuries ago. And it has absolutely nothing to do with, what you have on your passport as a nationality. It only counts where you are extremely powerful and you can impose with your violence your own authority. And that's exclusively what this world is. Right? And it's only through the mystics of the monarchy that, and of course a gradual development of the living conditions of the management of these broader masses and communities and so on, that something else was put together in a more constructive way, so that this wouldn't solve the problem, because the Carolingian Empire basically ended for the same reason. Right? Charlemagne, Louis the Pious were enlightened monarchs in this regard, understood that they had to create something more stable-like. They used the church. There was, however, still the nobility, but still with different successory rules, which weren't private, or at least not completely. And but for the rest, this empire crumbled, because outside of military expansion, it was basically nothing internally that would held it together. What do you think? The Carolingian fell because the Vikings arrived, the Magyars arrived, the Saracens. It didn't happen. Those were coming because the Franks destroyed themselves all by themselves, and exactly for this reason, it is the virtual absence of any idea of public state. In part, it was also a matter of possibility, because naturally from the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, something slowly, in turn, began to form. After this very shocking crisis that had struck, this collapse of the empire, also posed the terrible question, is we have lost God's favor. Because what these people exclusively believed, once again, is that this all was justified religiously speaking. Like, there was no other way, as we explained countless times, before the nation-state to justify anything that you could possibly imagine if it wasn't religious. So these people, doesn't matter what they believed, paganism, monotheism, if they lost, they realized that they had failed in front of the universe and the forces that moved it, right? And this is why also there was this, in more prosaic terms, however, these atrocious struggles we will see now, because there was no other way to impose yourself other than there was no justice to appeal to, but the one you would do by yourself, right? And the Merovingians added to this, which actually didn't help much, the fact that, differently from other Romano-Germanic countries, they had dynasticized power. So what you find in the Frankish world, that means, if that child is son of my brother, therefore, he can become an usurper, and if I kill him, I will, my children will be unchallenged, and therefore we find, literally from the sources, Merovingian children's, banged with their heads on the rocks, to get massacred. It's something you don't find in any other Romano-Germanic kingdom. at least systematically, almost institutionally, given that the Merovingian history is just the history of either military expansion or internal civil strife for taking out that other line of your own blood right out of the way, because you want to take their own part of inheritance. This is, I want to make it sound as brutal as it actually was, because this was the historical reality we're confronting. Other Romano-Germanic countries actually maintained different standards, at least, namely the monarchy was elective in the old traditional Germanic fashion. This was not enough to not cope. I mean, there were many other factors, naturally, that that we can imagine. For example, the Visigothic society was very, very similar to the Frankish one before the Islamic conquest. The Lombard society was instead very much more publicly oriented. In fact, much better balanced. These internal struggles basically didn't exist. But it was also smaller, for example, so that it was just like one Frankish Teilreich. And that's also one of the reasons why the Carolingians could convoy under their command eventually all these enormous clienteles in these enormous Atlantic plains of Central Europe, Western Europe, and to direct them to whichever target it was. It could be Saxony, it could be the Avars, it could be the Longobards. All these guys around, and naturally repressing the internal rebellions that also happened, because other peoples didn't like very much to be under Frankish control either, right? But it was, in a way, a winning model on the long run, right? Because it turned out, especially compared to other systems in Europe and in the Mediterranean, that the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, in spite of its political fragmentation, was a much more effective gluing factor than making an effort at some point to centralize further, right? Ask the Byzantines, ask the Umayyads, ask other powers that were properly states, right? Latin Germanic Europe wasn't anything like that. And yet, it basically surpassed them at some point by the 12th century, talking about the broader perspective of the Byzantine and the Arab world. Right, that objectively inherited the Roman, that also saw an increase of privatization, but not as nearly as what the Franks did, because this, by the way, was exported all over. Right, the Frankish world conquered all these other lands. It completed the conquest of Germany. It conquered Italy. It conquered parts even of the Iberian Peninsula. It basically conquered, William the Conqueror and his Normans were Western Franks at that point. It has absolutely nothing to do with wherever they descended from, and they weren't just descending from Vikings, by the way, from Scandinavians. But they were not like the Western Franks. They were literally Western Franks, and they conquer England, and England becomes that. They conquer Sicily, not William the Conqueror, but the Haute-Ville, and Sicily becomes that. Feudalism is all born chiefly in Merovingian times, by the way, in this area that is today's fundamentally northeastern France, Belgium, right? The most florid, the most articulated one, the most stratified one, and that eventually spread all over, all over Europe at some point, and that presented feudalism as we know it, because in the West, feudalism is Frankish feudalism. In other countries, it's different. Right, the paranoia is not feudalism. The Icta is not feudalism proper. It's something in between, and not necessarily more functional at some point. But now we're going definitely too far. So as we were saying here, private business is just a family that rules this entire world, with all the compromises at a local level, but still accepted at a local level as the holders of power. Nevertheless, the partition wanted by Clovis didn't bring suddenly to a fragmentation of the effective royal power, right? Especially in the first half of the 6th century, the system has altogether enough resources to invest, to expand the Frankish power, right? So it's possibly at this time also that, at least from an ideal point of view, the Frankish kingdom was always perceived, the Frankish dominion, generally speaking, was always perceived in a unitary way, right? That it didn't fall apart. So much as you know that the Franks initially were split in the Salians, the Ripuarians, so there was already this idea that, as always, as these broader confederations, that the name of the people is just an international shout-out, but it's, the rest, they're all different peoples that compose them, right? So it's already from this time that the Franks begin to also functionalize their society properly in an imperialistic sense. Right, in a properly military sense of expansion, connected to the military clienteles, the possibility of launching these big raids or even properly conquests in the surrounding against the surrounding peoples. And these guys already at the time spent their whole time on horseback, right? Or better, we made a video on the Frankish armies at this time. Most of them were actually infantry, but I mean, in a sense, the leaders. Specifically, and this idea of the chivalric elite was in at the core, right, already forming. And in fact, first of all, they had to deal at the moment with internal counterpositions that were unavoidable in such a world, as you understand. But in a few decades here, in the first half of the 6th century, the Merovingians managed to conquer new territories such as Burgundy, Thuringia, Provence, right? These were all different countries. The Burgundians were, as you know, they had been settled by the Roman as their defeat on the Rhine as federati in this broader area of Sapaudia in the mountains in southeastern France, and a mountainous area, very important, from which also they fought back against the Franks and never were completely assimilated. In fact, these old chunks maintained a bit of their ethnic, albeit mixed with the Franks, also because we've seen the Franks sent their own counts, their own elite, to literally marry into the local ones. Thuringia, as we were saying, was the Barbaricum, as you can imagine it. It was an area that had not known Romanization, was in the heart of Germany, and actually the Franks wiped out the Thuringians over time thanks to the help of the Saxons, the neighboring Saxons. So just to say that these people, it's not that cared about freedom as long as it was just their own. For the rest, they would gladly exterminate, enslave, and subjugate as much as they were pleased by it. But the conquest, the expansion of the Merovingians in Germany is also underrated, in my opinion, because mostly think about the one of Charlemagne in Saxony that just completed the conquest of at least the Germany of the time. It basically stopped to the Elbe. For the rest, in the east, there were Slavs. Because the colonization of certain areas of properly central Germany is carried out in Merovingian times, and that will be important also for the broader connections with the Danubian area, right? These territories in the right bank of the Danube were already Romanized superficially, actually, but the Franks at least expanded that direction already on an infrastructural base of sorts and so on. Central Germany is a work of the Merovingians, objectively. Also, they had to counter the Avar invasions at this time. The Avars arrived till, in fact, Germany, even till France, as if I'm not wrong, till Gaul, to sack, to pillage, not in a different way as the Hungars will do later, or as technically the Huns had done before. So actually, whoever settles on that frontier will start doing the same exact thing in the Pannonian Plain. And in fact, there is this very long Frankish tale towards the east that encompasses also the Bavarians, that as a people are actually a Frankish invention. Right? They're not even a kingdom proper, because they're not a people proper. They're this duchy that forms between the in southern Germany, between the Franks, the Longobards, is managed in that sense. Also, in fact, a weak subtle area where the influences of the two would be felt, but still connected to the Frankish world. And also, here there are all matrimonial ties. The other thing, you can't study Merovingian history if you don't, as well as Carolingian one or the following field, if you don't study on what at this point was already on the big scale, a policy of marriage, right? This already existed between the Ostrogoths, the Franks. There was this idea that this was also the time in which, ethnographically speaking, the same Germanic monarchies were beginning to recognize and to interiorize the fact that they were Germans, more or less, or at least that they had shared practices, cultures. Very often, kings coming from various countries would simply go, be namely adopted by the Merovingian king that would cut, his heir to pass into manhood. Many kings of the Visigoths, of the Longobards, of the Anglo-Saxons, they were all gravitating around this big system. And they were even friends, generally speaking. There weren't too many animosities, also because they had enough problems internally, and this would increasingly go on their own, that they wouldn't mind and mostly search for help from the outside, actually. So there were these broader international relations that are very important. As we've seen, the same Merovingians were partly Thuringian in origin. Provence, so the Provincia, as the Romans called it, because it was so Romanized in southeastern France. It was like a part of, it's as if it had been Italy, and in fact it had been conquered by the Ostrogoths back in the day, under Theodoric. Over time, during the Islamic invasions, for example, the Merovingians will call, not properly, Charles Martell will call, for example, the Longobards from Italy, that is just next door, crossing the Alps to invade Provence, for them. All this stuff was this frontier area by definition, as you know, that was quite happy on its own to be decentered in that sense. It was, under any strong control. Namely, was part of the Burgundian sphere of influence, especially after the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom, as you know. The Franks are very interested in it because, as you know, through the Rhone Valley, you connected the Mediterranean to Central Europe. So it was this enormous, historically speaking, this enormously important trade highway, right? In all this, during the Gothic, after the Gothic War, the Franks, albeit allied with the Byzantines, because they were both Catholic, first against the Arian Goths and eventually against the Arian Longobards, right? But they launched a ride together with some Alemannic dukes as well into Italy as well. The Burgundians also, there are some Longobards that invade Italy. At some point they cross the Alps. They're going to go and they're stopped by the Burgundians, the remnants of this actual Roman military administration of Burgundy that still works there with the protection of the Franks. This is very complicated. We'll look at that. It's very fascinating history, actually. So there is a bit this blurred line also for what concerns the under Clovis had been the famous conquest of Aquitaine, right? The Battle of Vouillé. The Visigoths are basically pushed into the Iberian Peninsula proper. They just remained with Septimania, namely held. But even Aquitaine, it's not completely held by the Franks. It will always remain kind of rebellious, autonomous on its own for a long time to come. You could say up to the 13th century even, right, in a historical perspective. Or even beyond, if you think about the connections with the English later during the 100 Years' War. But it's important because these chunks, let's say, culturally speaking, ethnically, we were formed a bit in these times, right? These balances of power were part of this broader world. And so the Franks basically, however, managed to push around themselves and to control the main surrounding peoples. And they start needing also to centralize a little bit, as we were saying before, for the sake of administration. And they, altogether, the Frankish world, stretches up to northwestern Germany, right? It's pretty long. It goes from the mouth of the Loire on the Atlantic, properly in western France under Bretagne, to the Elbe in Thuringia. So it's a very wide area. But naturally, as we were saying before, the most populated, the richest, at least for what Francia pertains, right? So the area where properly the Franks had settled, so that the rest were other people settled. Here, properly, the people had, is this square, we could say, based on important urban centers of the former Gallia Belgica. There are Soissons, where famously enough, was the kingdom of Syagris, the one basically last chunk of Roman government, not only in Gaul but in the west. 10 years after, actually 476, Reims technically was in Austrasia, but is, as you know, is fairly close to. It's in Gaul, first of all, so close to Paris as well. This also will become, as you know, so for the same mystics of the French monarchy, incredible. But it's where the kings would be crowned, right? Paris, right? Lutetia Parisiorum, and Orléans. That, as you know, also will have this symbolic meaning in history. And you see, it's this squares. It's a few hundred kilometers in distance, right? And that's where all the balance of power mostly is played, right? All the various Merovingian brothers, let's call it in this way, at this point, will rule from a bit more far away. But they would converge, generally speaking, to clash against each other in this area. That structures itself is the most strategically profitable, most important politically to control. So this in turn naturally favored also the consolidation around the sovereigns of certain nets of faithful magnates, right, of powerful men. We're talking either laymen or clergymen, right? Because at the time it was basically the same thing. As far as lifestyle was concerned, that were ready, naturally for their own interests, that were renegotiated every time, to serve militarily under them in case of conflict, right? So these were their clienteles in this rich, these are fat soils, for example. There is also probably also certain horse breeds that are, importantly now, the idea of the equestrian, permanent military, let's say professional lifestyle is formed around these areas. So around also the Roman infrastructures. There was also all the Belgica, as you know, here were for centuries, for half of a millennium, the Roman legions had been stationed. So there was also of infrastructures had been built specifically to resupply them. So this all passed more or less intact or transformed, however, still standing in the hands of the Franks. And that's quite important. Naturally, this produced the urbanization of Frankish aristocracy by a certain degree, and the consequent integration with the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, as we were saying before, mostly represented by the bishops that had basically taken over once the Roman state had vanished, that assumed as prelates, as was said before, this determinant role in the transmissions to the Frankish kingdom of practices of power and administrative structures of Roman tradition. And that would especially confer this aura of sacrality to Merovingian power, because it was exactly the one that maintained their prerogatives as much as they in turn maintained their own. That's the exchange, that's the favors, that's how power was negotiated. This alliance would be crucial, because in all kingdoms that you'll see, the clergy would be the friend. I mean, not always. Ask the Visigoths; that actually would have a very different opinion. At least as far as the kings were concerned, they were bullied by the clergy. Read the Visigothic nobility, but generally speaking, it's the clergy, the church proper, that maintains this great prestige in the institutional structure and backs the monarchy in return for protection and so on. As you know, the Gallic Church, properly the Frankish Church, actually will start to have its own liturgy, its own mysticism, its own saints. Think about Saint Martin, think about Saint Denis, Saint Geneviève. All these figures that will properly come to represent, let's say, a national church in the sense of properly, we are the Franks, and we are this Merovingian power that managed to really rule in the name of God, right? Thanks to also to the obsequium, to the reverence, to these saints, to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, to the sacred places, and so on, right? The rest of the countryside lived actually whatever they liked. They were still pagans, as we've seen, and it took a while before they start integrating effectively Christianism within it. It's customs, but naturally this happened mostly in the Romanized areas. And it's very important that the square we observed before is inside the Romance area, right? This is what will, also in historical perspective, will make, even here it didn't happen deterministically speaking, but what definitely helped to develop the French monarchy in an area was already richer, more advanced, better infrastructurally served than, say, Austrasia, where the Franks also were mostly coming from. That wouldn't see the rise of any major power of sort. During the Middle Ages, practically, aside from if you include Saxony, but Saxony is not Austrasia. In fact, just Franconia, we could say, that, however, was also fragmented, as you know. There's no generally. So, but that's the one of the Teutonians is really a different story and in a different reality. So, up to the mid-6th century, this system managed to hold together. Right, from the mid-6th century, objectively all over Europe, we see a contraction, chiefly connected to the Justinian pandemics, we think, but not all. Right, properly, if you look at the political military history of the Frankish kingdom, at this point you realize they started exhausting their own resources. Too many wars, too many devastations, too many destructions. This contracted. Like if Clovis was this great leader with pretty large armies under his command, launching campaigns of very far range. Here you see literally the Merovingians transforming themselves in local kings that, there's hardly a difference between a hunting, journey or a military campaign, right? Seriously, just look by scale. Just if you study the single campaigns, there is an evident contraction of resources. They simply didn't have more. So this might have been also a broader environmental reasons, but it's also connected to the exhaustion of the various resources already in late antiquity were not dramatically available, as you know, and especially in northern Gaul, that was some of the areas in which Roman culture kind of declined earlier and was, generally speaking, poorer, right? You see, they had a lot of wealth now concentrated in their hands locally, but they, from a relative point of view, of course, the richer areas were in southern Gaul, right? But the greater power altogether, by extension, by in quantitatively speaking, was in the north, and that's what it managed to keep these areas also down and fragment. The crisis, also from a strictly political dynastic point of view, happened at the death of Clotaire I, that for a short time had managed to retain control of all the Frankish kingdom. This happened, by the way, because he managed to, he had other brothers, and instead of fighting against each other, they still were able, as we have said, to launch campaigns all around, and Clotaire had managed to, to receive the support, the military aid of his brothers to share essentially the power quite fairly peacefully. Then he, just for biological reason, was the last one of the brothers to die. So he, by that time, he had brought together all the Frankish kingdom under his individual command. But once again, the game is very easy. He dies, so the thing is split again. His sons Chilperic I and Sigbert I, that were respectively king of Neustria and king of Austrasia. So, as we've seen, the two principal, I don't know when you say it, provincial or regional kingdoms that formed the Frankish kingdom proper, Francia. Relaunched, let's say, this long period of conflict, during which emerged, by the way, as protagonist, also a woman, Brunhild, that was Sigbert's widow, that at the death of her husband assumed the guidance of Austrasia, right, and for some decades played a decisive role in the interesting clash that torn apart the Merovingians, right. Brunhild is a very interesting figure. I would like to spend more time talking about her. At some point we will make also a video, because she represented in a way the symbol of continuity between the old kingdom of Austrasia and the new Francia, in a way. What does this mean exactly? First of all, Brunhild was actually Visigothic, right? She had been a queen consort under Sigbert I. Then she remarried, right? You know, it was she was regent for her son and grandson. You know, she maintained this very important role. But aside from the individual figure, which is extraordinary, also dramatic, unfortunately, she ended, as we will see now, in a very let's call it unfortunate, not really a problem of fortune, but she was deliberately massacred. She represented a broader culture, an institutional problem of the Frankish world that evidently, and especially in these times of crisis and contraction, had not been settled in a way, right? I can say that her period is like, the contraction of the Carolingian world, during the split, right after Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. Now there is a broader contraction, a new crisis, the empire splits, but it's similar to it in some ways. And what happens in here is that she properly embodied now Austrasia versus Neustria. So basically the Germanic chunk of the Frankish kingdom against the Romance chunk of the Frankish kingdom. Why is this important? Well, no, I don't know her so well. I should read more actually in terms of what, but I don't think we know it. But the fact she was also from Spain, where might have retained this Aryan background that, in a way, historically had been looked upon with favor by those yet pagan German areas, including Austrasia. It was dramatically less Christianized, and it basically wasn't Romanized at all. At the times of the Gothic alliance, right, of the Ostrogoths and Visigoths against the Franks and the Byzantines in this broader funk. We made a lot of videos on this topic. That's extremely important, because that's the whole history of the first half of the 6th century in this broader international relations, right? So she might have had to do with the support of at some point the nobility rebelled against her as well, because in all this, let's not forget, the nobility did exist, and of course they retained this kind of egalitarian era. All these Merovingians were struggling for reinforcing their own monarchic power as well. So very often the nobility intervened, because it said, wait, we need these kings to legitimize us as nobility in the institutional context, but we don't want them to become too powerful to take power away from us. But generally speaking, she might have been seen as a relic of that pagan and Aryan traditionalism that was embodied by Austrasia in a way, if not Aryan, but still pagan, as we've seen, against the Neustria, against the most Catholic and Romanized area of the Frankish kingdom. This subdivision is important because at the time, evidently, Neustria and Austrasia were fairly well balanced in power, so it was not entirely clear who would prevail. Right, the power, I presume, was already shifting since the beginning, as that's also what the Frankish migrated to westwards, right, towards Gaul. but at the same time, these other areas of origin in part said, but what about us, right? Are those guys there, settling in the richest areas and, transforming into kind of Gallo-Romans and Catholics and becoming ever more powerful and wanting to impose to us those systems that we don't want at all, right? And making it simple, because of course we don't stress it, there were different factions regarding to this, but it was all a political game, right? It's not that here there is any specific, I doubt that these people reasoned by simply caring about what the same, Arian or Catholic, what the whole thing does. Of course, there was a connection with the political and social practice, but it's like, you can easily see it, in the Lombard kingdom, in the Visigothic kingdom, it was the same problems, because those countries converted later to Catholicism. Specifically, the Visigoths officially in 589, so it's the same years of Brunhild here. But it was mostly like, the king that wanted to enforce. It really depends on the areas. For example, in the Visigoths, the kings wanted to remain fundamentally Arian and let's say more kind of traditionally oriented to Arianism, against the rest of the nobility. It was getting Romanized and Catholic, right? So the power of the struggle of the crown against the councils of Toledo that represented the nobility was not because these people cared so much about the Arian or Catholic point, but simply it was a struggle of power between two different systems of power that had formed at that point, right? This is easily seen even in the Lombard kingdom. Everybody thinks that the Lombards struggled for religious, but they had nothing to do with that. There were pre-existing parties. Someone backed Arianism, namely, and not even causing. There is no proof of, for example, of religious persecution of sort. So it was just an excuse, like a banner, to say, okay, we are the ones that now currently believe this, but if we need the thing to be done, we pass to the other side. We'll have to come back talking about Lombard history, because that tells you so brilliantly how devoid of contents the thing was as far as the political opportunity was concerned. Then of course these people actually believed in it in some ways, but we don't know. I mean, they might have shifted. What do you think, that Clovis was a true Christian? It's difficult to say. Nobody knows, right? Like nobody knows with Constantine or others. It's more interesting to look at the times and realize what were the various options, what was the normality also of the syncrasies, which is typical of the time. But Brunhild was this very energetic woman, on which, and here we get to historiographical problems, also kind of a black legend was created because of the fact that she was eventually accused of having killed 10 Merovingian kings, and that she was in fact put to death, actually torn apart by tied to 4 horses and dismembered like that. That's the end. That's a pretty good picture of the degree of sheer violence that reigned during Merovingian times. And the end, her defeat. So, however, this important historical process, for which the Merovingian branch tied to Neustria, so basically Belgica, right, the former Gallia Belgica in northern France, sanctioned this definitive turn in Frankish politics that was ever more oriented towards the territories of more recent conquest, right, and in particular towards the Mediterranean dimension broadly meant, right? So this was being ever less a Germanic power and ever more like a, could say, Romance, if you don't want to say a Roman proper, but even in here, it's not about necessarily the ethnicity, the order. It's not about this. It's about here it's on a broader scale, because as we were saying before, Gaul was simply a better place to live and to build a power of, to construct a power easily. But also it was much more connected to the Mediterranean, to the contacts with the Roman Empire. that in all this is always there, and we know that in fact the same Clotharius, the Clothar II, was Chilperic's the first son. That was the one that killed Brunhild. Was, for example, very he was a literate. I mean, he represented the Romanized Frank at that point. He knew Byzantine literature. He composed. He had this broader relations, interests. He worked in the Salian law also to improve the living condition of women. This is an important thing, not to read in the modern key. That has nothing to do with that, but also to stress the fact that the law excluded them from inheritance, but it was broadly speaking properly a Germanic law that people today, I don't know why, they need to say that Germanic laws were liberal with women. When every person who has studied, even knows what Germanic laws were about, that were repressive systems that, of course, maintained that the woman had to be protected, that she had to have a tutor specific, but always guided in a society where men ruled, as most societies at the time. Naturally, this is not a criticism to it, but properly saying that this picture of democracy, egalitarianism, the fact, for example, that women could divorce in North society, that has nothing to do with their living conditions, right? On the contrary, Roman law was actually much more open. Gave more freedoms to women, and the political practice of the Salian, the juridical practice of the Salian law in this most developed, also florid, people lived better in Gaul. Was this attempt to say, okay, let's tighten this grip on, let's give some extra autonomy to the woman. This is something that was done even in the juridical practice in Longobard early. So this idea that, for example, Catholicism was repressive, as if the pagan women lived more freely than Catholic or Roman. Are you kidding me? Have you even studied this? I haven't ever studied Roman law or Germanic laws at that point. Right, and the excuse they usually put is that, no, because, when the Germans put things in written form, they were influenced by the evil Christianity. No, you don't understand that. In the tribal world, there was no option to take another path in your life than the one that society imposed to you. Even the possibility of divorce is not a proof of greater freedom. It's still mediated by men. It's still essentially a business of problem of procreation and inheritance and all this stuff. It's very contractual. It's nothing to do with the actual freedom of the woman, right? And you can't absolutely compare, in early medieval times, the more primitive tribal world and its alleged freedoms with the ones of this already post-Roman, more developed, more advanced areas. This is unfortunately done constantly because, once again, first we have demonized the Norse, the Vikings, and so on. Now that they have to be the superheroes of the situation, also for disgusting ideological reasons in both sides. That's not history, right? Read a comic book. Stop reading. I mean, either you start reading history with the capacity to understand it, with the opening that is required. Otherwise, just know that history doesn't care anything about your personal opinions, right? Study for real, not read whatever you want to read. Or listen to whatever you want to listen. Do a research. Do your work. Do your job as a historian, and not trying to enforce stupid ideologies you have heard somewhere because you are not even capable not to project your modern obsessions into the past. It has nothing to do with that. In either ways. So. Brunhild, now I don't know, unfortunately we don't know so much about these figures, right? And especially as we enter into the 7th century, we know even less about Merovingian history tout court, right? But it's definitely, she impresses me particularly because, in my opinion, there is also another reading of this history of the Romanization of Germanic peoples today that wants to say, well, nobody actually cared about the cultural divides. All the Germans wanted to be Romanized because they wanted to improve their living condition. It wasn't really like that, right? And I don't say it either now because I want to, counterbalance for ideological reasons. Simply that there were different interests at stake, and we know that every time there is a big decision in a society, there is always another party who says no, or has something to lose from it. Right. So the struggle, especially among the Franks that were so loosely, so superficially Romanized at the beginning, was actually very strong. And it's not surprising at all in this perspective that Brunhild might have cleverly exploited this enmity that existed between the two areas and trying to make especially Austrasia imposing itself. Austrasia has a very fascinating history, by the way, because just to make an example, I mean, you would think the Franks or the Saxons were always enemies and so on, but they actually were very similar, right? Austrasia and Saxony were almost homogeneous societies at certain level, especially at this time. And they were also more militarized, broadly meant. That is, Gaul was developing now more advanced, or it had a more advanced military system. But the most combative areas, because of constant frontier warfare with this other Germanic people, it was pretty tough, pretty intense. There were still forces to spend from both sides. There were probably, as we're seeing now, two different models that are, conflicting with each other. But Neustria wins. And this is not, in my opinion, by chance, or at least obviously it happened for a reason, and this reason is that they had already more advanced assets and, to spend. Clotaire II is a proof of this. In his policy, he strengthened, for example, the political administrative organization of his kingdom by consolidating its articulation in the three regional kingdoms, Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundia. Also, he gave new impulse to the office of majordom, famously, or master of palace, the major domus. So the greater lord, that previously had indicated the functionary entrusted to to deal with all the, let's say, organizational matters of the royal court, the palatium or the domus. And that from this moment instead began to designate, in fact, the principal royal functionaries placed at the head of the three regna. Now, this is very fascinating as a terminology because especially Austrasia and Neustria, as we have seen, were part of Francia, broadly meant. It was a unique kingdom. But here, the two chunks are probably recognized as regna on their own regard, right? It's as if they had been two kingdoms. So wide areas, we've said. So it really does correspond to different regions, to different language, right? Different cultures we've seen, and even different beliefs, naturally. Another aspect is definitely of importance is the rise of these functionaries as part of a broader, of the relic of a sort of a subtle administration, the one that had been attempted by the Franks at the beginning of the 6th century. That, however, now privatizes as well. In these figures, there are not just, palace functionaries, like you could imagine, even in a Roman context, properly noblemen, powerful noblemen with their own military clientele, with their own capability, with their money, that would even enlarge, provide for to the kings at some point. The palatium, the domus, also here is this. The Merovingians lived usually in these broad households, right? That weren't, we've seen, they chose often urban centers, but they preferably lived actually in the countryside. It was a very rural world, right? In northern Gaul, in these areas, the urbanization contracted more than other areas. So it was actually the countryside, differently from other areas of the formerly Western Roman Empire, that where power was properly concentrated. Even just think about the control of the land, of this power, and so on. So the idea, as we will see now, is that gradually the Merovingian dynasty famously will lose once again, because after Clotaire II there are other problems. There is this phase of stabilization we'll see now at the beginning of the 7th century, but eventually the Merovingian power starts going downhill further. The power contracts. There's properly not even a real center, and the major domes are seizing power, right? As privates in some ways, to become even more powerful than the kings, famously enough. Hence, let's say the idea of the roi fainéant, right? That since Agenard, this idea that they were just bunch of, they just followed the majordome as a legitimizing figure next to him, usually transported on a chariot with oxen. So something was not denied, a virile symbol of warriorhood and so on. But actually, that's a very stereotypical picture, right? And there were certain kings doing nothing that actually did important things, such as Chilperic II, Dagobert II. They were not just idlers, and this is in fact a bit of a picture that we get stereotypically from an historiography that blamed the Merovingians for specific political reasons, and for a time, in fact, in which there is no other documentation. We don't even know who these kings at some point were. So it's kind of complicated. But this is important because to the rise of the Maior Domus, of the Maiores Domini, is connected naturally the beginning of the Pippinid-Arnulfingian dynasty. It's the Carolingian one as we know it from later times. Even in here, many people say, "Oh, look, the Carolingians already existed in the mid-7th century, even before actually, because the genealogy is to be followed even before." But even in here, there is no real teleological connection, nor to what they would become, nor even the chance of it. Many people look at the 683 Battle of Tertry as if that was a moment in which the major domes of Austrasia, that is how eventually the Pippinids-Arnulfings rose at that point, began to dominate now. So this is absolutely not true. That there was a lot of other wars and extremely complicated political turns before they effectively, the Carolingians managed to effectively put together this broader Frankish kingdom on the wake, on the the track of what the Merovingian power had been before. Because as we were saying, the Merovingians, after all, had made it to establish the idea that there was a monarchy, and there was a dynastic one, and it was recognized with this idea that there were certain specific kingdoms, certain specific dominions that were part of this great wall that back in the day had been conquered with the favor of God and the legitimization for the Frankish people to rule, right? Even on behalf, sometimes in the areas of Rome. The Germans were extremely proud in this sense to have taken over the land that was previously ruled by the Romans, because they thought they were sharing, in this sense, getting part of the power that had allowed the Rome to be the universal empire, and they felt consequently morally superior to them because they thought they were the only true virtuous warriors that had won that because of their special character. And they were truly fanatics in this regard. I mean, they truly believed it in a way that was extremely violent and still was at the head of this broader military society that was gradually taking shape in an ever more, impacting fashion. Right, over time, here in all this political mess, however, at the private level, the clienteles are expanding. Right, the powers of the individual lords are enlarging. So that's also what this system will implement over time, and will allow even the Carolingian wave to exploit these forces that were under them to expand further the boundaries of Frankish power. And the Carolingian dynasty takes the name. Why do we say Pippinid-Arnulfings? Because they descended by two very important exponents of the Austrasian aristocracy, because the Carolingians, as we've seen, were Austrasian in origin, that through their support had been actually decisive in the victory of Clotaris II against the same Brunhild, which also shows how way more composite actually the Austrasian reality was, right? Naturally, before we were simplifying for the sake of realizing that there were different broader perceptions of the thing, but here, especially in terms of what the nobility was concerned, the political games were at this point devoid of any specific ideology, right? It was just a struggle for power and how to get it. And in fact, we get Pippin the Elder, also known as Pippin of London, and Arnulf of Metz, right? Bishop of Metz, to be more precise. And Arnulf appears in 614, let's say, as Bishop of Metz and preceptor of Clotaris II's son, Dagobert I, that will be, it's historiographically considered to be the last effective Merovingian ruler that objectively put an end a bit to most struggles, but simply because all his brothers had died, so he reunified, as it had happened with Clotaire I, all this thing together after things went downhill. The other, Pippin of London, was Major Domus of Austrasia, right? And they were, in this sense, some of among the most influent characters of Frankish aristocracy, and they met as relatives as through the marriage of Pippin's daughter, Begga, and Ansegisel, son of Arnulf, right? That allowed to the two families to unify essentially their interests in rising with uniting their powers, their patrimony, this apparently unstoppable rise that at that time was all but, unstoppable, but it began there properly, if anything from a genealogical point of view. We know also of their ancestry, by the way, so the Carolingians are technically pretty old, but their families rose to prominence here. Consider that also, Pippin the Short or Charles Martell proper was a bastard. Here, by the way, we didn't say that it was very difficult for all these figures. For example, we talked about Clotaire I, Clovis' son at the time. Yes, these converts, namely Christians and so on, but it seems that they didn't care very much. They were pretty much, insufferent sometimes to Catholic rules. They naturally, this is not a moral problem. This is a problem that the church, to recognize their monarchy, wanted privileges, and which meant in practice that their lands would not be taxed. These people needed, the Merovingians needed money constantly, but for their survival, all their wars. So he was felt, Clotaire I, for example, taxed the church, and this, the church spoke badly of this. Also complained of his many concubines, right? Because it was normal for Frankish kings to have many women. This would remain also in Carolingian times. That this caused an embarrassment in Christian terms, because already at the time was believed it was excessive, right? But it was not done much for a matter of luxury, or it was properly like a privilege that was properly attributed to conferred to the kings proper, because they were thought that in this way they could strengthen better through the various sons their it was a way to compensate that fragmentation we were talking about before. It was to create more unitary stocks that could support each other. Unfortunately, as we have seen, they forgot the other half of the part, that is, they as long as they kept splitting their own inheritance equally, the thing would restart over again. In fact, the late Carolingians began, if you know the story, even how the dominions of Charles the Bold were created, trying to split the inheritance among the various sons, but trying to make like larger chunks and smaller chunks so that it wouldn't be fragmented in as many sons that they had legitimized. Women in all this, before with Brunhild, we didn't stress it, but women are extremely important in all Frankish history, exactly in part because of this, because they had the kings had many wives, but secondly proper because all these women naturally pushed a lot. Charles the Bald is a very good example in Carolingian times, his mother, for naturally having their sons legitimized and becoming kings, getting part of that freaking inheritance that everybody was waiting at every time the old man died, right? And hence certain ferocious struggles even with women. Brunhild, for example, was ferociously adverse to Fredegund, who was also to have been conceived as an extremely ferocious woman who killed other women, who made it, there are objectively in Frankish history there's these horrible stories that are a bit, the gossip and the Black Legion that eventually was painted over them. But we factually know that they spent the entire lives plotting against each other. All these conspiracies, assassinations. Most of these kings actually would die assassinated. It was like very ugly in this sense, and part of the political and institutional instability, or even large part of it actually, derived exactly from this, right? So we have seen with the marriage of Begga and Ansegisel how the Arnulfingians or Pippinids or Carolingians, whatever you want to call them, began proper. That's also a very beautiful example of what how the laymen and clergymen were at the same level in this sense, right? They were fundamentally noblemen. They had their families, their sons, right? It was just like Arnulf of Metz was elected bishop just because there was this vacuum, and he was noted for his administrative skills. You want to be bishop of Metz was a pretty important center, by the way. Before Paris was even one of the capitals of the of Neustria. Yeah, and that's how it began. He already had the sons, but basically a bishop would have the same identical lifestyle of every layman. And I stress here identical. They were warriors primarily. That's all what they did in their entire lives. Already at this time, even before the Carolingians. So regarding the church and those problems, even Charles Martell, for example, that eventually is being painted historically as the most Christian era, but actually the contemporary ecclesiastical press, let's say, anachronistically in Gaul, actually hated him because he was the one that began to retax during the Carolingian expansion, that retook all those, territories, those assets that once had belonged to the king. As we've seen, this all belonged theoretically to the king. Now with the Merovingian crisis, all these local lords had taken over, including the bishops, right? So he had taken away from lots of bishops, lots of land. They were triggered and they wrote bad stuff about him, but that was the important and complicated relation with the church that we have to imagine in this context. Then we don't talk specifically about the various events that brought Carolingians to power because it's long, but anyhow we will have to do it on another more dedicated video. This is kind of a manualistic video. It was mostly about the Merovingians, but speaking about the rise of the Carolingians in this Merovingian wake. So the Carolingians first of all managed to do something that was to rend something that tells you how, even here, how privatistic this whole system was. That is to render hereditary the office of major-domo. Which means that they were basically kings, right? That's the point. As we've seen before, Clotaire II had disposed of all these various kingdoms proper, these various chunks at the head of which these majordoms were. You render that elective. What's the difference between that and a king and a Merovingian himself? They are kings, right, already in practice. Just they lack a crown, formally, from an institutional point of view. But in practice, they were kings as they disposed of the same royal estates, right? And that's the important thing. They began to manage this enormous amount of land that theoretically belonged to the kings, right? Here, we should learn possibly to detach ourselves from the Black Legion of the Merovingians and realizing that some of the Merovingians were just a bunch of idiots, stayed enclosed into households, and while the majordoms laughed outside, swimming in money and, oppressing the rest in their name. It was way more balanced than this. But, of course, this process was just the reflection, broadly speaking, the rise of this Majoris Domini was the reflection of the privatization of certain areas of the kingdom that couldn't be controlled, especially in the periphery, by the kings, right? So these figures began to create military clienteles through the distribution of the lands. This Vassalatic-Beneficiary system in embryo that was already there since late Roman times, as we've seen before. And in the long run, the Carolingians managed to empty gradually the prerogatives of the Merovingian sovereigns. The interesting thing, though, is that they do not take autonomously the step to take the Merovingians out, because the Merovingians had been able in all this to enforce so much the ideology of the sacrality of their blood, right, already before the Carolingians. So the idea that those were the guys that ruled, that God had chosen to rule this immense thing, that there was technically no possibility now to step in their place. And that tells you how much the thing differed from the older tribal times, for which rising to power would have been enough. Now, the Merovingians had objectively created an institutional structure that couldn't be surpassed so simply. Right, and it was also useful, right, to think that there is a sovereign that is actually the guy that you get the legitimization from. So you're not personally the same, you're not so exposed as him theoretically. Like, you're not the one that, the pawn, right, in all this process. But of course, over time, there was the need of substitution in a way. Very important in this process was naturally at the beginning of the 8th century Charles Martell, that is not Charles the Hammer, as is often done, often thought because of also the Battle of Poitiers, but actually because of the small Mars. That's what Martell actually means. That naturally, underlined its military gifts, but not quite in general, let's say, not specifically. He had obtained this astonishing victory against the Muslims at Poitiers. This actually contributed to his fame, but if we concentrate too much on Poitiers, we kind of lose track of what, at that point, already the Carolingians were capable of doing within the Francia, right? That as a broader process, and also to explain how the Franks managed to stop the Muslims at Poitiers, albeit, years after they reinvaded Gaul and raided, so it was actually, it didn't stop there, right? Muslim presence in southern France lasted up to the 11th century, episodically, so, and actually continuously for a long time after, during the 8th and 9th century and beyond. But the broader point is the legitimizing project of the Carolingians that marked eventually the non-coming back point, right, of the relations between the family masters of Palace and the Merovingians. And this was the prelude to the dramatic overthrowing of Chilperic III. That was in 751. He was allegedly the last of the Merovingians, but it seems that he was just a puppet figure. That he wasn't even descending from the Merovingians. They had just appointed him to make the show done, but he wasn't even a Merovingian himself anymore. This tells you how the situation had fallen into. Let's be honest about this. By the end of the 7th century especially, there was no Frankish kingdom as such anymore, right? It's just through the Carolingians that there is this revival of this broader military clienteles, but by the 7th century, there is no true power there, right? It's not a substitute by someone else. Properly, this thing had exploded into these 4 chunks and it didn't work, right? This is important for the sake of governability. I mean, the fact it makes it even more astonishing how the broader Merovingian ideology survived and was collected eventually also by the Carolingians themselves in this sense. The last Merovingian sovereign was enclosed in the Abbey of Saint-Bertin in the very north of France, close to the sea, after he had his long hair cut, right, which in the traditional Frankish culture was the symbol, the supreme symbol of force and therefore of royalty, right? But what's one of the elements, legitimizing elements of a Merovingian Catholic king? The most typically pagan idea that you have to have long hair to be a strong man, right? That was still leaving. It was actually considered very important. One value that eventually even the medieval knights inherited from this Germanic world also, that was broader part of the pagan world, technically speaking, was beauty. You had to look beautiful. Doesn't matter that this thing of the long hair, they had to ostentate that because it was felt like there was an intrinsic quality in your stock if you could boast that. That is fascinating because other peoples didn't actually give a damn. Like when the Mongols defeated his German and Polish knights at the Battle of Legnica, and then those were thought to be the strongest because they had this long hair. So now they get massacred by the Mongols. Were commanded by a general that was so obese that couldn't even move on a wagon. So there are these notes that we could also digress on the various relics of paganism that definitely were there. These people were barely Christianized still to this point, right? They surely believed in it, but how they believed in it, that was the serious problem, right? Especially the lay world in this regard was very distant from what we think it. We think it was a real. What does it mean to be religious in? How does it mean to be Christian in the mid 8th century, in a place like northern France, right? That's a challenge historically speaking. We don't even know technically, and we know that not even the clergy actually understood much of it. The Carolingians needed an entire ecclesiastical reform to put an end to that, to just get the clergy to even know how to write or even read correctly Latin. We know that they couldn't, right? Some could, right? The most educated, but the average was something incredible. This was still, in many ways, a military and pagan-minded world, largely. And they just used the monotheism to reinforce their own institutional prerogatives and to exalt themselves further, by selecting essentially the aspects of it that they found to be more fitting with their own culture, which were included exclusively the military ones, actually. This idea of the blood effusion, we said at the beginning, this emetophiliac character of the Merovingian way, it's a strongly borderline between Christianity and paganism. It's strongly influenced by this tremendous vision of the world. It's a bit the dramatic fate of the warrior in the pagan, in the sagas, in the songs. These people heard that, right? That they sang that the world military ethos was fundamentally pagan. Hell, we know even by the 7th century in the Byzantine army, it was the most Christian power out there. We know what the soldiers believed in at some levels. The symbolisms, the actions were completely pagan. We're all obsessed about the animals, the powers, the various Potropaic rituals. We find basically no trace. This could have been Homeric warriors as far as we're concerned. And we have to be extremely serious and honest and open to this, because that's what we just see historically speaking, and we can't deny that. And we have to accept that certain processes took a long time to happen, and that this tortuous path also between the Merovingians and Carolingians was an important step to assess and to realize how these beliefs that were so deeply imbued within these people could be reconciled with a more civilized way of living, right? That, technically speaking, as we have seen already within the same Frankish world, had brought to differences, to contrasts, to conflict, right? And in order to legitimize the position of Chilperic the Third, it was that was aimed at by the Carolingians to give properly to legitimize also its right, their right as a dynasty to guide the Frankish people, right? This was the point. Recalling the in fact the biblical model of King David, that from that point onwards would remain the model, in fact, of the Carolingian Empire as well. It's an essentially veterotestamentary, it's an essentially Jewish model. And once again, this is nothing to do with my personal opinion. This is what we teach in every Western academy. The Carolingians were essentially looking at that as a model. And essentially because of the anointed of God, of David, and so on, as the kings of Israel, Pippin, the Short, had himself at this point consecrated with the holy oil that would remain historical. Also, if you think about the French monarchy, the holy anointing, and so on, by Boniface, the Saxon monk that already with Charles Martell had this crucial role in creating a strong bond between the Franks and the Church of Rome as well. Right, before that, it wasn't so clear as it. Actually, already the Merovingians had a strong bond with Rome, but here was dramatically reinforced also in international fashion that had not been properly conceived in Merovingian times, at least in that scale. And this anointing ceremony was, in fact, repeated solemnly by Pope Stephen II, that had favored the rise of the Carolingians. Also, in order to grant to the same papacy a valid ally against the hegemonic claims of the Longobards. That's all of another story we'll retell some other time. So there is an aspect, let's say, that the Carolingians opposed to the pagan sacrality of the Merovingian kings. That is a new Christian sacrality. Right, aside from their own personal beliefs, but the fact that now the fates of the Franks were connected with the alliance alliance with the papacy, right, in an international scenario that was yet to be developed, to take proper form, but that, as you know, would be at the base of what we know as known as the Holy Roman Empire up to the 19th century. And it started exactly with this premises, right? And we know that this is not no contradiction, because we perfectly know that the papacy had an idea what the Franks had to be. The Franks had another idea what they were, right? The struggle for investitures began in a way in the same year 800, because there were certain aspects of the whole story that had not been said. Was that legitimized the Franks for ruling all over Europe? The papacy, the Pope properly, or God, right? That was a debate, and there were strictly pragmatic political reasons for which eventually the papal line prevailed, and the Carolingians accepted as their imperial successors that their legitimization had to pass through the papal crowning, right? And that's, if you think about the path, right, of how this happened properly. In some videos, we will talk more specifically about how the Merovingians also were connected to the papacy, in a preferential way that objectively no other kingdom, Romano-Germanic kingdom in the West had, right? This is in a way also a Merovingian legacy in the Carolingian War, right? And together with this process, naturally the Carolingians began this denigratory operation towards the Merovingians we were talking about before, the Damnatio Memoria, that found its apex in this historiographical works composed in Carolingian court in the first decades of the 9th century. So 6 years after the Merovingians had been formally overthrown, but more than 150 years from the disappearance, let's say, of the concrete Merovingian power. And this is kind of ironic because it's the Merovingians who had done this all, right? The Merovingians were represented in these works as the idlers that had, albeit having held for a long time the face of the Franks in this kind of paternalistic sense, actually as kings that had imposed themselves on their own people brutally. Now they were represented as, naturally this was all by the 9th century, it's in a completely Christianized, edifying, moralistic fashion. So this is probably not history, right? It's history in the moment in which, of course, there was some remnant, some relic of it. There are certain interesting aspects that, of course, also the Carolingians recognized of the Merovingians at the time. Agenard wrote about this quite openly, the fact that after all they were the ones that had ruled, they were the true kings. This passage reveals how important still the Carolingians at the beginning of the 9th century. We could have said, we don't care, we completely can fake everything. No, they still recognized that the Merovingians were, after all, because they legitimized themselves through them, right, through the continuity, through the continuation of the Merovingian authority that had decreased, a bit like it had happened with the Romans, right? The Romans lose Gaul, the Franks take over because they are the chosen ones. So now the Carolingians do the same exact things as kings of Israel, right? It's the same exact thing. This is how they build it conceptually, and that's what is highlighted by those works. And naturally, there is, aside from the, let's say, the better testamentary models here are very well framed under a elaborated historiographical model that is, it's mostly the Ottonians that will recover the full, also philological literary property of, the legitimization. At this point, mostly of the Romanity of the empire. Here, the Romanity of the empire in the Carolingian times is also not excessively, stressed, not even after 800. Because after all, they don't care so much. They felt still more distant. They still felt from the Frankish perspective of the story. But aside from this elitistic thing, there was also the idea that it was instead to be spread in other ways we don't know, because they were mostly oral, among the masses, among the population, in the sense that, in a truly Germanic sense, and in that military sense, we were military religious, we were saying before, it was used to legitimize the rule. That is to say that the Merovingians had not been able to give an effective lead to their people, right? So that meant that those in the Germanic mindset, that meant that the incapable leader was useless, had to be taken away, because in theory, by tradition, the only one who is elected to that post is just for a momentary war in which he has to defend the people, and if he fails, of course, he is it was a heavy thing also in the Germanic world in tribal times. At this point, naturally, it's not even about what the masses or the people properly think, but rather what the nobility thinks of it, because the nobility in all this thing has also taken over society. All the Carolingian clientele through which they rule, it's the Carolingians can't conquer the world just because they could promise and to give eventually the land they would conquer to the nobility. They heavily depended on the nobility. This is something that in fact increased over time. The same decline of the Merovingians is fundamentally that, right? Because who were the Carolingians themselves? But if just one of the other noblemen. So these noblemen also absorbed this rhetoric. They spread it. They stressed the fact, of course, the Merovingians had been incapable in this regard because they had been the same ones that had delegitimatized them, and that therefore could in turn delegitimize even just the Carolingians at some point. And the Carolingian Empire will implode within itself in the same way, in a way. So it's not that there is a specific center will say, let's take down the authority proper. Because as we've seen, even between the relation between the Merovingians and Carolingians, and now even between the Carolingians and the local powers, nobody won from stating from denying the authority of kings, because potentially one of those noblemen could become a king and rule in turn. So it was just an eternal competition in stressing who is that has to rule. And in fact, if you think just about the kingdom of the Western Frankish kingdom, even Hugh Capet was still elected by the 10th century. Right, this idea of ancient Germanic idea. It was just an oligarchic, aristocratic praxis, as we've seen. That the king that was chosen was just the first among equals, right? That was legitimized as long as he displayed this military capability in a moment of emergency. Right, it's also how the Ottonians will rise. Right, Germany was even less controllable in a way. Was even less developed in a monarchic sense, but there are the Magyar invasions in the 10th century. The Eastern Frankish princes decide to give power to this Saxon duke, and okay, let's choose him among us and see what happens. And he managed to win, but it always comes to a crisis in a way. So you understand how much there is to say and how. I don't know. It's fascinating to me to look at these relations. I think it's very important to really understand those worlds and to properly, first of all, to get rid of any idea of kings that ever had actually an iron-fisted power, by as if they were perfectly just because it was them. Right? Even if you look at Clovis, we have seen that, as powerful as he could be, he had to negotiate the construction of the kingdom with the local Gallo-Roman elites. It's an eternal negotiation. The myth we have been obsessed by, with the powerful ruler that comes and rules just in virtue of himself, it's a myth. Right? It's a myth exactly inflated by the same propaganda that has legitimized him. But the political reality is always that messed up, especially in a world that didn't know any central power. So these individuals were extremely strong, especially from an individual level. But the world system now couldn't be properly managed in a way. They just rode the wave that at that point allowed them to do so. And even and this is the point I would like to leave you with, that even the decline of the Merovingians, of the Carolingians, it's a circle apparently, right? It's not because this or that ruler was an idiot or incapable or morally wicked, because this is how 19th century historiography has used us to think in a way. Then the Merovingians were a bunch of idlers that just spent their time, in their households with the concubines and eating and stuff, while the majordomes set all the empire together. It's simply a balance of power, of which that produced in turn an ideology that had to justify the new asset, the new rule, the new regime, by demonizing these other individuals. And this propaganda wasn't even evil in the sense that, the Carolingians had animosity towards them. At this point, the Merovingians were ineffective. They didn't care. They were just a scapegoat, ideologically. They had other problems. That was to keep all their clienteles under control. And that's what forced them also to, and in the broader thought, and this is also important to in the perspective of improving, after all, because the powerful leaders in this sense are not the evil guys of the situation who just want to oppress their next. There are also people that say, let's try to, first and foremost, to pacify this reality, right? Because this reality was never peaceful, was only violent. Every political dialectic was translated into warfare. There was no other way even in there to gain power. The Franks did sometimes horrible things. They even with treachery. It's very famous, if I'm not wrong, in 745, the extermination of the Alemannic nobility. They invited them in the north, and they took them out en masse altogether. You know, something extremely violent. If you look, everybody who is acquainted to Merovingian history knows that the sheer amount of violence at every level at court in the Merovingian family, it was astonishing. But that was that world. And it's paradoxically through that violence that we should find the logic of this all. And unfortunately, the historiography of the time doesn't help us more than much, because if you read Gregory of Tours, that, as we were saying, looked at Clovis essentially as the new Constantine. So it's pure model of Christianity, of good ruler, and so on. And then looked at the various Frankish counts, including his personal enemies sometimes. And you realize that he's painting the Frankish counts as children. And there are even interesting, behavioral aspects in this, like, we know were typical even of medieval knights. These were people that were capable of chopping children apart, and then crying just listening to a song that talked about, I don't know, their mother, right? We know that people that are grown with that general, extreme level of abuse and violence and constant exposure to the most horrifying things you can ever imagine have this kind of reactions. But what is important is to understand why the system forced them to be like that. And you will realize that it was a broader logic in that it forced them to be like that, exactly because it was the only way in which they could hope to remain afloat as power. So it was not just the fact that they were unruly. Of course, a Frank of the 7th century didn't know anything about, order or discipline in a sense of, in a political institutional sense. They didn't give a damn. They didn't know what it was. But it is because that world objectively didn't give them any other option. And these are things that we build over time, and it is sometimes even through this incredibly tormented is the best adjective you can use of Merovingian history, periods in history to realize what also was created. The Franks were to create the largest power ever seen at that point. They would conquer half of Europe. And they would spread a system. Their political legacy, it's basically non-existent because the empire simply vanished. They invent the empire to result in mediation with the papacy that creates it, but that's at a highly institutionalized, it's also an ecclesiastical question of it's very complex, right? But properly speaking, they create this Vassalatic-Beneficiary system that eventually will survive, as we were saying before, up to conceptually in the Ancien Regime, up to the beginning of the 20th century, that will have made truly the West, as in part, of course, but overwhelmingly at some levels as we know it. And the roots of all these processes are what will change, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, the history of mankind forever. Because what the Franks did is something incredible that we don't find properly in other world societies. Right? If you look at, at China or, these great other poles of power like India or Persia, or the Muslim, look at the Mamluk, the Arabs broadly meant, the Byzantines. They will not be. They will always create powers that will exhaust themselves at some point, just like those same late antique societies had done in Europe and in the Mediterranean. The Franks create in Europe something that will go beyond, without collapse. into the feudalism, into eventually the modern state that is formed through that base. It's truly incredible, right? In the modalities, especially considering the background, these were fairly, they weren't particularly developed areas in Europe at all. The context here is dramatic. It's not that you can say that China also improved, but that was a millenary empire. In these areas, up to a few centuries before, there hadn't been much consistently, palpably. These guys invent this. That is essentially not even something material, strictly speaking. Yeah, it's based on the land. Of course, there is a very strong material component to this, but it's mostly about a relation that is created, a dialectic that is created between the institution and the people, in a way, right? It's simplified this way, even between the fierce struggle between the monarch and the nobles. There is in embryo this idea that there is a dialogue, and dialogue is fundamental for critical skills for the development, for discourse, for it's at the base of the West in some part. This is not all, right? The Franks aren't in this sense the only factor that made the West. Not probably even surely not even the most important in relative terms. Yet without them, we would know a very, very different world. And this has, and all the participants here are valid. This is about the Gallo-Romans. This is about the Germans. This is about that specific context. Even the proximity of the Byzantine Empire, the existence of other Romano-Germanic kingdoms around, the different models of Central and Eastern, still, European, still semi-nomadic, realities. There is also Northern European, but you understand the complexity of these all. So that history can never be read deterministically speaking, but still we should understand clearly what are properly the basis that eventually bring to such results. Which in case of the Franks, I hope this video didn't sound too brutal, because I went hard today, even in trying to picture the Merovingians. So it's history is that dark. Here there are not the heroes of the story that you can dream of at night of being like that. These were a bunch of murderers, right? And as most of people were at the time, but here in a systematic and almost institutionalized way, concretely. But yet it's essentially from that crisis we're saying that there is a positive synthesis. There is an improvement that is required, in a way necessarily by human nature, that must be appreciated. So always remember, the history of civilization is that controversial. It doesn't care absolutely nothing what you think of it. It doesn't care absolutely nothing of what you would have liked, you wished it went like. Here there is just crude history in the way we can trace it, and us realizing that we are directly the consequence of that. Hell, we are even the same people, practically. And we gotta live with this, which gives you a tremendous discomfort at some levels, but from the others it empowers you, because it makes you realize what this knowledge is like in terms of the burdens of responsibility of handling it, right? And that's exactly what a Carolingian count or Merovingian count would have on his shoulders. And it's very hard to us, with the morals that we have developed from a couple of centuries to this point, to accept, to make a work of, not of justification, but just of motivation of what it was back in then. Because now every time we see something violent, we automatically assume it was wrong. That's exactly the point. 95% of this was pure horror. 5%, however, is something that you didn't have before. It was created there, and it still builds part of what is positive today. And without these guys, we wouldn't have it. So think about it. Alright, so for now we'll stop it here. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.